Buddy, you're confused. This is first class. Economy is that way. Find yourself a nice middle seat in row 45. The words sliced through the cabin air like a blade, sharp and dismissive. They came from Bradley Harrison, a man whose $4,000 Armani suit and slicked-back blonde hair screamed mid-level executive trying desperately to look like a CEO. He didn't even glance up from his tablet as he delivered the insult, his manicured fingers dancing across the screen with theatrical importance. Standing before him in the aisle of Delta Flight 104 was Marcus Williams, 36 years old, wearing a charcoal cashmere hoodie and matching joggers that looked casual but cost more than most people's monthly rent. His vintage leather weekender bag was slung over his shoulder, worn and traveled telling stories of 1,000 miles. On his wrist, hidden beneath the cuff of his hoodie, sat an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak worth $180,000, a watch that could buy a house in most American cities. But Marcus Williams didn't care about the flex. He just wanted to get to London. The snow outside Terminal 4 at JFK was coming down in biblical sheets, a white curtain of chaos that had already canceled over 200 flights. It was 9:45 p.m. on New Year's Eve, and the departure board looked like a Christmas tree of red, delayed, canceled. The air inside the terminal was thick with panic-stale coffee and the desperate prayers of thousands of travelers who just wanted to get home before the ball dropped in Times Square. Marcus had been in the Delta Sky Club when the announcement came. Elena Rodriguez, a young Latina attendant with tired eyes but genuine warmth, had approached his table by the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Mr. Williams," she'd whispered, holding out a fresh boarding pass like it was state secrets. "We managed to get you on Flight 104. It's the last bird leaving tonight before they shut down the runway completely. Seat 1. A first class. The captain wants to beat the storm, so boarding is happening immediately." Marcus had looked up from his sparkling water, setting down the acquisition documents he'd been reviewing. At 36, he had the kind of stillness that made people nervous, not threatening, just intensely present. His dark eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen enough of the world to know that chaos was temporary, but character was permanent. "Thank you, Elena," he'd said, his voice a deep, calm baritone that seemed to absorb sound rather than create it. "Happy New Year." "Happy New Year, Mr. Williams. Safe travels." Marcus grabbed his bag and headed for the gate. He moved through the terminal chaos with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to navigate hostile environments long before he could afford to avoid them. His noise-canceling headphones blocked out the cacophony of crying children, angry passengers, and harried gate agents. When he reached gate B32, the final boarding call had already echoed through the speakers. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with stress lines etched deep around her eyes, scanned his pass. The machine let out a happy beep, and Marcus walked down the jet bridge into the cold January air that seeped through the gaps in the tunnel. He stepped onto the plane, and the warmth of the cabin hit him. Immediately, leather seats, sanitized air, and the soft hum of wealth insulating itself from the storm outside. He turned left toward the first-class cabin, and that's when he saw him. Bradley Harrison was already settled into seat 1. His legs crossed with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the world owed him comfort. He was sipping a pre-flight mimosa, the golden liquid catching the cabin lights as he typed furiously on his tablet. His navy suit was pristine. His tie knotted with military precision, and his pocket square matched with the kind of coordination that screamed trying too hard. Marcus paused, checking his boarding pass again. 1A, Marcus Williams. He took a breath, feeling the familiar weight of a moment he'd lived before, not in first class, but in boardrooms, hotels, restaurants, and 1,000 other places where his presence had been questioned before his credentials were checked. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb the other passengers settling in around them. Bradley held up one finger without looking, silencing Marcus while he finished typing what was clearly the most important email ever composed. After 5 agonizing seconds of theatrical importance, he hit send with a flourish and finally deigned to glance at the man standing in the aisle. His eyes swept over Marcus like a security scanner hoodie jogger's worn leather bag. The sneer that curled his lip was almost reflexive muscle memory from years of making snap judgments about people who didn't look like him. "Can I help you?" Bradley asked, his tone dripping with the kind of boredom that rich white men used to dismiss service workers and anyone else they deemed beneath their notice. "I think you're in my seat," Marcus said evenly, holding out his boarding pass. "I'm in 1A. Bradley's laugh wasn't friendly. It was sharp barking, the sound of a man who'd never been told no by someone he didn't respect. "Buddy, you must be confused," he said, pointing a manicured finger toward the back of the plane like he was directing traffic. "This is first class. Economy boarding is that way. Go find row 45 before the overhead bins fill up." Marcus didn't move. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardening that spoke to battles fought in boardrooms and won in silence. "I know where economy is," Marcus said, his voice dropping half an octave. "My ticket says 1A. Please check your boarding pass." Bradley sighed a loud theatrical exhalation designed to signal to everyone within earshot that he was being harassed by an idiot. "Look, pal," Bradley said, turning back to his tablet in dismissal. "I upgraded. I'm a Platinum Medallion member. I've been flying this route since you were learning to tie your shoes. I'm sitting here now. Run along. I have work to do." The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus felt a familiar prickle of heat on the back of his neck, the same feeling he'd had at 24 when a hotel manager in Miami had looked him up and down and said, "You don't look like someone who'd stay here." That night he'd slept in his rental car and spent the hours before dawn sketching the business plan that would eventually become quantum dynamics. Now, standing in the aisle of a plane he could buy with pocket change, facing a man whose salary was probably less than what Marcus spent on watches, that same feeling returned. But this time it came with power. Marcus looked across the aisle to seat 1B, where an older gentleman with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses was watching the exchange over the top of his Wall Street Journal. The man's eyes widened slightly when they met Marcus's, and Marcus saw something flicker across the older man's features. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise. Harold Meridian, 64 years old, CEO of Meridian Industries, and the man Marcus was flying to London to replace, had been expecting this meeting for months. But not like this. Not with his own VP of operations stealing his replacement seat and treating him like a criminal. Harold opened his mouth to speak to greet his new boss and put an end to this embarrassment, but Marcus gave him the slightest shake of the head. "Not yet," the look said. "Let's see how this plays out." Harold, a shrewd businessman who'd built an empire by knowing when to watch and when to act, closed his mouth and settled back into his seat. A small, curious smile played at the corners of his lips as he folded his newspaper. This was about to get interesting. Marcus turned his attention back to Bradley, who was now making a show of adjusting his seat and requesting another mimosa from a passing flight attendant. Sir Marcus said, his voice firm but controlled, "I'm not going to ask you again. You are in my seat." Bradley slammed his tablet down on the tray table with enough force to rattle his mimosa glass. "Are you deaf, or do you just not understand English?" he snapped, standing up to use his height, all 6 feet of entitled mediocrity, to intimidate. "Do you know who I am?" "No," Marcus said calmly, his own 6'3" frame making Bradley's attempt at physical dominance look childish. "And I don't care. I know who I am, and I know that's my seat." "I am Bradley Harrison," the man announced, as if he were declaring himself King of England. "Senior Vice President of Operations for Meridian Industries. I am on my way to London to close a multi-million-dollar deal. My time is worth $3,000 an hour. Your time is worth whatever minimum wage is these days. Bradley Harrison. Marcus almost smiled. He knew the name, had seen it on the HR roster he'd been reviewing all week. Bradley Harrison was the executive who'd been flagged for excessive expense account irregularities and a management style that HR had diplomatically called problematic. Marcus had actually made a mental note to review Bradley's department first thing after the acquisition closed, and here he was living up to every red flag in his personnel file. Bradley Marcus said, tasting the name like wine. Well, Bradley, unless you bought the airline, that seat doesn't belong to you. A flight attendant rushed over Jessica Morgan, 26 years old. Blonde ponytail pulled tight, stress written across her features like a road map of the evening's chaos. The pilot was already announcing door closure over the intercom, and she could feel the pressure of 300 passengers who just wanted to get to London before the storm grounded everything until January 2nd. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her eyes darting between the two men like she was trying to defuse a bomb. "Yes," Bradley barked, pointing a finger at Marcus's chest. "This individual is harassing me. He's trying to hustle a seat he didn't pay for. Get him out of here so I can work." Jessica looked at Marcus, then at the boarding pass in his hand. She took it, scanned it with her handheld device, and the machine beeped green. She checked the seat number, then looked at Bradley with the expression of someone who'd seen this movie too many times. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" she asked Bradley, her voice straining with the kind of patience that comes from years of dealing with entitled passengers. Bradley rolled his eyes like he was being asked to prove his citizenship. "I don't need to show you my pass," he huffed. "I told you I'm a platinum member." The gate agent waved me through. "This is harassment. Sir, I need to see your boarding pass." Jessica repeated her customer service smile, beginning to crack around the edges. Bradley huffed, dug into his jacket pocket like he was being forced to dig his own grave, and produced a crumpled boarding pass. He shoved it at her with the disdain of a king forced to deal with peasants. Jessica scanned it. The machine let out a low, unhappy buzz, the sound of lies being exposed by technology. Sir Jessica set her posture straightening as the facts became clear. "This boarding pass is for seat 14B. That is in Comfort Plus. It is not in first class." The cabin went dead silent. Several passengers in rows 2 and 3 stopped their conversations and turned to watch. Harold Meridian in 1B lowered his newspaper completely, watching Bradley with the intensity of a hawk that had just spotted a field mouse. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a crash. Bradley's face turned a violent shade of red that clashed with his navy suit. But instead of apologizing, instead of quietly gathering his things and slinking back to his actual seat, he doubled down with the desperation of a man whose entire identity was built on never being wrong. "That's a computer error," Bradley lied smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who'd talked his way out of bigger problems than this. The agent at the gate upgraded me verbally. She said, "Mr. Harrison, thank you for your loyalty. Please take 1A. If your computers haven't updated, that's your incompetence, not my problem." Jessica's jaw tightened. She'd been working flights for 6 years, and she'd heard every lie, every excuse, every creative fiction that passengers could invent to get something they hadn't paid for. "Sir, verbal upgrades aren't policy," she said firmly. "And Mr. Williams here has a paid ticket for this seat. I'm going to have to ask you to move to your assigned seat in 14B. Bradley looked around the cabin like he was searching for allies for someone else who would see the injustice of a man like him being forced to sit with the common people. His eyes landed on Roberto Silva, a Hispanic businessman in seat 2B, who was quietly holding his phone at an angle that suggested he was recording every word. "You want me to move for him?" Bradley said, his voice rising enough that the passengers and coach could probably hear him. He gestured at Marcus like he was pointing out a dangerous animal. "Look at him." He looks like he's here to rob the plane, not fly on it. How did he even afford this ticket drug money lottery winnings? The racism hung in the air like a toxic cloud, heavy and unmistakable. Marcus's hands balled into fists inside his hoodie pockets, but he forced them to relax. He had worked too hard, come too far, and built too much to let a middle management bigot make him lose his composure 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. But the insult hit deeper than Bradley could know. It carried the echo of every time Marcus had been followed through a store, every time a police officer had asked him what he was doing in his own neighborhood, every time someone had looked at his success and assumed it came from anywhere but his own brilliance and relentless work. From seat 1B, Harold Meridian looked ready to explode. His knuckles were white as he gripped the armrest, his decades of corporate politeness warring with his disgust at what he was witnessing. He started to rise from his seat, but Marcus caught his eye again. "Wait," the look said. "Let him finish digging his grave." Marcus turned back to Bradley, his voice dropping to just above a whisper, the kind of quiet that made everyone lean in to listen. "Mr. Harrison," Marcus said, "you're making a mistake. A very expensive mistake. The only mistake Bradley spat, emboldened by his own righteousness, is the airline letting people like you up front. This isn't a charity flight." He turned to Jessica, who was now looking at him with undisguised disgust. "I am not moving," Bradley declared. "I have a bad back and I need the legroom. If you try to move me, I will sue this airline into the ground. I know the VP of operations at Delta personally. Do you want to lose your job, sweetheart?" The threat hung in the air like a weapon. Jessica was 26, had student loans, and couldn't afford to lose her job over a seat dispute. The plane was already delayed, and if they had to call security to drag Bradley off, they would miss their takeoff window. The flight would be canceled, and 300 people would be stranded in New York for New Year's. Marcus saw the panic in Jessica's eyes. He saw the pilot looking out from the cockpit, checking his watch. He saw the passengers behind them tired and desperate to get home to their families, and he realized that if he pushed this, everyone would pay the price for one man's arrogance. Marcus Williams was a leader, and leaders sometimes took the hit so others didn't have to. Jessica, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension like a lifeline. "It's okay." "Mr. Williams, it's not okay," Jessica said, tears pricking her eyes. "It's your seat. You paid for it." "The flight needs to leave," Marcus said simply. "If we argue, nobody flies. Does seat 14B have a window?" "Yes, but I'll take it," Marcus said. Bradley let out a triumphant whoop that echoed through the cabin like a victory cry. "See?" he crowed to anyone who would listen. "Even he knows he doesn't belong here. Smart move, kid. Go sit where you fit in." Marcus leaned in close to Bradley, invading his personal space just enough to make the arrogant executive flinch. "Enjoy the seat," Bradley Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a promise. "It's the last comfortable place you're going to sit for a very long time." Marcus turned to Harold Meridian in seat 1B, the man whose company he was about to buy, whose industry he was about to revolutionize, whose employee had just humiliated him in front of a cabin full of strangers. "Sorry for the disturbance, sir," Marcus said with the kind of dignity that made apologies sound like benedictions. "Have a pleasant flight." Harold nodded slowly, his eyes holding a mixture of profound respect and anticipation that Bradley was too drunk on his own victory to notice. "You too, young man," Harold said, his voice carefully neutral, but weighted with meaning. "I have a feeling things are going to work out just fine." Marcus threw his weekender bag over his shoulder and walked toward the back of the plane. As he passed through the curtain that separated first class from the rest of humanity, he heard Bradley loudly calling for another mimosa, and make it a double, Bradley's voice carried through the cabin like a victory lap. "I'm celebrating. The walk to seat 14B felt like a journey through time. Past the business class passengers who'd heard everything through the premium economy section, where people looked up from their phones to watch him pass, and finally to row 14 where the seats were cramped. The legroom was minimal, and the smell of someone's fast food dinner lingered in the recycled air. Marcus found his assigned seat a middle seat between a teenager listening to music at volumes that would damage his hearing and an elderly woman knitting what appeared to be the world's longest scarf. He squeezed his 6'3" frame into the space designed for someone considerably smaller, his knees pressing against the plastic back of the seat in front of him. He pulled out his phone before switching it to airplane mode and opened his encrypted messaging app. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, sending a message to Diana Rodriguez, his chief legal officer, who was already in London waiting for the acquisition to close. Draft termination papers for Bradley Harrison FIV-P operations at Meridian, effective immediately upon my arrival. Also contact our liaison at Delta. I want the passenger manifest for Flight 104 preserved, and I want security footage from the boarding process. We're going to need it. He hit send, switched his phone to airplane mode, and leaned back in his seat as much as the cramped space would allow. The plane jolted as it began its pushback from the gate, the engines spinning up with a whine that promised 6 hours of discomfort. Up in first class, Bradley Harrison was living his best life. He had kicked off his Italian leather shoes, a breach of aviation etiquette that made Jessica visibly cringe, and his sock-clad feet were propped up on the bulkhead. He was on his third mimosa and feeling invincible. "This is how it should be," he said to no one in particular, loud enough for Harold to hear. "Order restored. Everyone in their proper place." Harold Meridian closed his eyes and tried to count to 10. In 40 years of building Meridian Industries from a small machine shop into a global manufacturing powerhouse, he had encountered his share of difficult people. But Bradley Harrison represented everything that was wrong with modern corporate culture entitled lazy, and convinced that his position gave him the right to treat other people as less than human. What made it worse was that Harold knew exactly who Marcus Williams was. He'd been following quantum dynamics for 3 years, ever since the young CEO had started quietly acquiring manufacturing patents and technology companies. Marcus wasn't just smart. He was visionary, the kind of leader who could take Meridian Industries into the next century while preserving everything Harold had built. And Bradley had just treated him like a criminal trying to steal a seat. The plane reached cruising altitude and the fasten seatbelt sign chimed off. Bradley immediately stood up and stretched his movements exaggerated and performative. He walked to the galley where Jessica was preparing the meal service and leaned against the counter with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the world existed for his entertainment. "So, sweetheart," Bradley said, his words slightly slurred from the alcohol. "What's the story with that guy? The one trying to steal my seat. Is that normal? Do you get a lot of his type trying to upgrade themselves?" Jessica looked at him with barely concealed disgust. She had been working in aviation long enough to recognize casual racism when she heard it, and Bradley wasn't being casual about anything. "Sir Mr. Williams had a valid first-class ticket," she said professionally. "He chose to move to accommodate the flight schedule." Right, Bradley said with a knowing wink. "Customer service. I get it. You can't say what you really think. But between you and me, we both know what was really going on there." Jessica turned away from him without another word, but Bradley didn't take the hint. He was drunk on alcohol and power, and he needed someone to share his victory with. "You know what I do?" Bradley continued following her as she moved through the galley. "I run operations for one of the largest manufacturing companies in the world, Meridian Industries. Maybe you've heard of us. We make the parts that keep planes like this in the sky." He gestured around the cabin like he personally owned the aircraft. "The point is," Bradley went on, "I know people. I know how the world works. And people like that guy? They don't belong in first class. It's not personal. It's just reality. There's an order to things, and when that order gets disrupted, everyone suffers. From his seat in 1B. Harold could hear every word, and each one made him angrier. This wasn't just about racism, though that was bad enough. This was about a fundamental misunderstanding of what leadership meant, what success looked like, and what kind of company Meridian Industries was supposed to be. Harold had built his company on the principle that excellence had no color, no background, no pedigree, only results. Some of his best executives were people who'd started in the mailroom, worked their way through college at night, and earned their positions through pure determination. The idea that someone like Bradley, who'd inherited his first job from a family connection and coasted on privilege ever since, would judge someone like Marcus Williams based on his clothing was not just offensive, it was professionally disqualifying. But Harold held his tongue. He wanted to see how far Bradley would dig his own grave. Back in economy, Marcus was reviewing the quarterly reports on his laptop, the screen balanced precariously on the tiny tray table that dug into his stomach. The numbers told a story that was becoming clearer with every page. Meridian Industries was profitable but barely, and there were red flags scattered throughout the financial statements like landmines. The biggest red flag was in the operations department. There was a variance of nearly $4 million that was categorized under external consulting and logistics optimization. In corporate accounting, that kind of vague language usually meant one of two things: incompetence or fraud. Marcus made a note to audit the operations department immediately after the acquisition closed. He highlighted Bradley Harrison's name in his files and added a priority flag. Something wasn't right with the numbers, and something definitely wasn't right with the man currently celebrating in Marcus's stolen seat. As if summoned by the thought, Bradley's voice carried back from first class loud enough for half the plane to hear. The problem with diversity hiring Bradley was saying to Harold, who was pretending to read his book while actually documenting every word in his mental filing cabinet, is that it puts unqualified people in positions they're not ready for. I mean, look at this merger we're going through. Quantum Dynamics is buying us out, and their CEO is some kid from Chicago who probably got his startup money from a government grant. Harold's grip on his book tightened, but he said nothing. Marcus Williams Bradley continued, the name rolling off his tongue like he was talking about a fictional character. I Googled him. 36 years old. No Ivy League education, no family money. How does someone like that build a company worth billions? It doesn't add up. Bradley took another sip of his drink and leaned closer to Harold as if sharing state secrets. Between you and me, I think there's government money involved. Minority business loans, tax incentives, maybe even some backdoor deals with federal contractors. That's how these diversity cases get ahead. They're playing by different rules. Harold felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He was listening to one of his own executives, a man he paid 6 figures a year, casually accusing the most successful entrepreneur he'd ever met of being a fraud. And doing it with the kind of confidence that came from never being challenged, never being held accountable, never facing consequences for his words. You seem very confident about that assessment, Harold said quietly, his first word since takeoff. Oh, I am, Bradley said, emboldened by what he took for agreement. See, I know how the real world works. I've been in manufacturing for 15 years. I've seen guys like Williams come and go. They make a lot of noise, throw around buzzwords like innovation and disruption, but when it comes time to actually run a real business with real products and real employees, they fold. Bradley finished his drink and signaled for another. The beautiful thing is, Williams needs me more than I need him. He's buying Meridian for our infrastructure, our relationships, our institutional knowledge. But he doesn't understand manufacturing. He doesn't know our suppliers, our processes, our customers. Without me, his whole acquisition falls apart. Harold closed his book entirely, now giving Bradley his full attention. And what makes you so indispensable? Harold asked, his voice deceptively mild. Bradley grinned, the alcohol making him more honest than he'd been in years. "Because I know where all the bodies are buried," he said with a laugh that wasn't entirely joking. "I know which vendors give us kickbacks, which inspectors look the other way, which inventory reports get adjusted to meet quarterly targets. Williams can fire me if he wants, but if he does, I'll take half our client relationships and all our operational secrets with me." Harold felt like he was watching a man commit suicide in slow motion. In just a few sentences, Bradley had admitted to accepting bribes, regulatory violations, and falsifying inventory reports, any one of which would be grounds for immediate termination and possible criminal charges. But Bradley wasn't done. The alcohol and his own sense of invincibility had opened the floodgates. Plus, Bradley continued lowering his voice to what he thought was a whisper, but was actually loud enough for Roberto Silva in 2B to record on his phone. "I've got insurance. I've been moving money into offshore accounts for 2 years now, just small amounts skimmed from the consulting budget. If Williams tries to fire me, I'll disappear with enough cash to retire in the Caymans." Harold's blood ran cold. Bradley wasn't just admitting to fraud, he was bragging about it, to a stranger on an airplane, while flying to meet the new owner of his company. "How much money are we talking about?" Harold asked, his voice carefully neutral. "About $4 million so far," Bradley said with pride. "All perfectly legal, technically. I set up a consulting company and the Caymans approved contracts with myself and processed payments through normal channels. The paperwork looks clean, but the money ends up in my personal accounts." Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook. He uncapped his fountain pen, a habit from the days when he'd started Meridian Industries with nothing but a legal pad and a dream, and began writing. "Offshore accounts. $4 million. Consulting fraud, vendor kickbacks, false inventory reports. That sounds risky," Harold said, still writing. "Risk is just another word for opportunity," Bradley replied, quoting something he'd probably read in a business magazine. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Williams fires me and I disappear to a beach in the Caribbean. There are worse fates." Harold finished writing and closed the notebook. The trap was set. The confession was recorded, and the evidence was documented. All he had to do now was wait for the plane to land. But Bradley still wasn't finished. The alcohol had loosened his tongue, and 20 years of accumulated resentments were pouring out like water from a broken dam. "The thing that really gets me," Bradley said, his voice rising again, "is the assumption that guys like Williams are somehow better than guys like me. He gets celebrated for being a young black entrepreneur, like his race is some kind of achievement. But where I come from, we judge people by their character, not their color." Harold looked at him sharply. "And what exactly is your judgment of Mr. Williams's character?" "I think he's a fraud," Bradley said flatly. "I think he's riding a wave of political correctness and government subsidies, and when that wave crashes, he'll be exposed as just another affirmative action case study." The cabin went quiet around them. Even the ambient noise of the engine seemed to fade as Bradley's words hung in the air like poison gas. Other first-class passengers had stopped their conversations and were staring at him with a mixture of shock and disgust. Roberto Silva, in 2B, was no longer trying to hide the fact that he was recording. His phone was pointed directly at Bradley, and his finger was steady on the record button. Jessica had stopped serving drinks entirely and was standing in the galley, her mouth open in disbelief at what she was hearing from a passenger in her cabin. And Harold Meridian, the man who had spent 40 years building a company that prided itself on meritocracy and excellence, felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart that would come later during the turbulence, but something deeper and more fundamental, his faith in his own judgment as a leader. How had he missed this? How had Bradley Harrison risen to VP level in his company while harboring these attitudes? How many other employees had been passed over, ignored, or driven away because of the toxic culture that Bradley represented? Harold thought about Marcus Williams, cramped into a middle seat in economy, quietly reviewing financial reports, and preparing to lead a company where men like Bradley felt comfortable expressing views like this. The irony was devastating. The most qualified leader Harold had ever met was sitting in coach while a racist criminal fraud was drinking champagne in first class and planning to embezzle millions from the company Harold had spent his life building. Harold made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to wait for London. He wasn't going to let this play out in some sterile conference room with lawyers and HR representatives. He was going to end Bradley Harrison's career at 30,000 feet in front of witnesses with the new owner of Meridian Industries watching from the cheap seats, just as Harold decided shouldn't have to wait for a layover. 2 hours into Flight 104, the cabin lights had dimmed to a soft blue that encouraged sleep. Most of the passengers had settled into the rhythm of the flight, some dozing, others reading, a few still working on laptops balanced precariously on tray tables. The steady hum of the engines created a cocoon of white noise that made private conversations feel possible even in a metal tube hurtling through space at 500 miles per hour. Harold Meridian was not sleeping. He was watching Bradley Harrison with the focused intensity of a predator studying its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Harold had built his fortune by knowing when to be patient and when to act decisively, and right now patience was serving him well. Bradley, meanwhile, was feeling the effects of his fourth mimosa. The alcohol had made him loose-tongued and confident, the kind of dangerous combination that led men to confess their sins to strangers. He had kicked off his shoes entirely now, another breach of etiquette that made the other first-class passengers exchange disgusted glances, and his feet were propped up on the bulkhead like he owned the aircraft. "So, what's your story, old man?" Bradley asked. Harold, his words slightly slurred, but his voice carrying the false camaraderie of someone looking for validation. "You in business? You look like business." Harold marked his place in the biography of Winston Churchill he'd been pretending to read and turned his attention to Bradley with the deliberate focus of a chess master considering his next move. "I was," Harold said carefully, "manufacturing, heavy industry. I'm in the process of stepping back, transitioning to retirement." Bradley's eyes lit up with the excitement of someone who thought he'd found a kindred spirit. "Manufacturing," Bradley exclaimed loud enough that several passengers looked their way. "That's my world, brother. What company?" "You probably haven't heard of it," Harold said with the kind of humility that came from 40 years of letting his work speak for itself. "Small operation. Family business." Bradley laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Try me. I know every major player in manufacturing. Meridian Industries, where I work, we supply half the industrial base in North America. If you're in manufacturing, we probably buy from you or sell to you." Harold felt a cold smile play at the corners of his mouth. This was too perfect. "Actually," Harold said, "you're quite right. I have heard of Meridian Industries. Excellent reputation, solid financials. Though I understand there's been some upheaval recently. A buyout." Bradley's chest puffed up with pride, and he leaned forward conspiratorially. "Not just any buyout," Bradley said, lowering his voice to what he thought was a whisper, but was actually loud enough for half of first class to hear. "Quantum Dynamics, Silicon Valley tech company. They're paying $8 billion for us." $8 billion. He shook his head like he couldn't believe the number himself. "The crazy thing is they don't even know what they're buying. The CEO, this kid named Marcus Williams, he thinks he's getting a manufacturing company. What he's actually getting is 40 years of relationships, institutional knowledge, and operational expertise that you can't learn from a spreadsheet." Harold nodded thoughtfully, playing his role perfectly. "And you work there?" "At Meridian work there." Bradley laughed. "Brother, I run the place. VP of Operations. I know every supplier, every process, every shortcut that keeps the machine running. Without me, Meridian is just a bunch of expensive equipment and real estate." "That's quite a responsibility," Harold said. "The new owner must be very interested in retaining someone with your expertise. Bradley's expression darkened slightly, and Harold could see the resentment that had been building for months. "That's where it gets interesting," Bradley said, finishing his drink and signaling Jessica for another. "See Marcus Williams, the new owner. He's what we call a diversity hire CEO. Young black from Chicago. Probably got his startup money from government grants and minority business loans." Harold felt his jaw clench, but he kept his expression neutral. "You seem very certain about his background," Harold said. "I Googled him," Bradley said with the confidence of someone who believed 15 minutes of internet research made him an expert. No Ivy League education, no family money, no connections. How does someone like that build a company worth enough to buy Meridian Industries? It doesn't add up. Bradley leaned closer to Harold, his voice dropping to what he thought was a confidential whisper. "Between you and me, I think there's government money involved. Set-aside contracts, diversity quotas, maybe even some backdoor deals with federal agencies. That's how these affirmative action cases get ahead. They're playing by different rules than the rest of us." Harold reached for his leather notebook, the one he'd carried to every important meeting for the past 20 years. He uncapped his fountain pen with deliberate care. "That's a serious accusation," Harold said mildly. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "Evidence?" Bradley laughed. "Look at the math. 36 years old, minority status, billion-dollar company. Come on. The only way that happens is with help. Government, help political, help the kind of help that guys like me don't get." Harold began writing in his notebook, his handwriting neat and precise after decades of documenting important conversations. Racist assumptions about government assistance. Affirmative action accusations. No evidence provided. "And what makes you think you deserve the same help?" Harold asked, genuinely curious about the psychology of entitlement he was witnessing. Bradley's face flushed slightly, whether from the alcohol or indignation Harold couldn't tell. "I've been working in manufacturing for 15 years. Bradley said, his voice rising enough that Roberto Silva in 2B looked up from his phone. "I've earned everything I have. No handouts, no special treatment, just hard work and results." "And what exactly are those results?" Harold asked, his pen poised over the notebook. Bradley grinned, and Harold could see the pride and arrogance that had been building for years. "I've saved Meridian Industries millions of dollars through operational efficiency," Bradley bragged. "I've streamlined our supply chain, optimized our inventory management, and built relationships with vendors that give us competitive advantages our competitors can only dream about." Harold nodded encouragingly, sensing that Bradley was about to reveal more than he intended. "For example," Harold prompted. Bradley leaned even closer to Harold. Leaned even closer to Harold. Here's something Williams will never figure out." Bradley set his voice thick with conspiracy and alcohol. "Our quarterly numbers look clean on paper, but the reality is more flexible." Harold's pen stopped moving. This was it, the moment Bradley would destroy himself with his own words. "Flexible how?" Harold asked. "Well," Bradley said, warming to his subject like a professor delivering a lecture. "Let's say we have a bad quarter. Maybe our suppliers are late. Maybe a client cancels a big order. Maybe the market shifts, and we're stuck with inventory. We can't move. Normally, that would show up as a loss on the quarterly report, right?" Harold nodded, though every word Bradley spoke was making him feel physically ill. "But I've figured out how to smooth out those bumps," Bradley continued. "I move inventory between our warehouse in New Jersey and our depot in London. On paper, it looks like sales jersey ships to London. London shows revenue quarterly numbers look good. By the time anyone audits the transactions, I've moved the inventory back and processed it as a delayed delivery." Harold's pen was moving again faster now, documenting what amounted to a confession of securities fraud, inventory manipulation, false revenue reporting, fraudulent quarterly statements. That's, Harold searched for the right word, creative accounting. Creative is right, Bradley said with obvious pride. I've been doing it for 3 years now. Saved the company from 6 different quarterly losses. Management thinks I'm a genius, but really I'm just willing to do what it takes to get results. Harold felt like he was watching a man dig his own grave with a golden shovel. Every word Bradley spoke was another crime admitted, another ethical violation, confessed another reason why he should never be trusted with responsibility for anything more complex than a coffee order. But Bradley wasn't finished. The alcohol had loosened more than just his tongue. It had apparently dissolved his judgment entirely. And the best part, Bradley continued, is that I've built myself a little insurance policy. Insurance policy? Harold asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. See, all those vendor relationships I mentioned, some of them are, let's call them consulting arrangements that I've set up through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Harold's blood pressure spiked, but he kept his voice level. Shell companies. Oh yeah, Bradley said, reaching for his fresh drink. Meridian pays my consulting companies for logistics optimization and supply chain analysis, perfectly legal contracts all approved through normal channels. The money goes to the Caymans, gets cleaned through a few accounts, and ends up in my personal portfolio. Harold's pen was moving so fast now that his handwriting was becoming illegible. Shell companies, Cayman Islands, money laundering, self-dealing contracts. How much money are we talking about? Harold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bradley grinned like he was discussing a particularly successful golf game. About 4 million so far, he said with obvious satisfaction. Small amounts spread over 2 years. Nothing that would trigger automatic audits, but enough to set me up very comfortably if this quantum dynamics deal goes south. Harold stopped writing and looked directly at Bradley for the first time since the conversation started. You're stealing from your own company, Harold said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Stealing is such an ugly word, Bradley replied, his tone defensive but not ashamed. I prefer to think of it as ensuring my long-term financial security. See guys like Marcus Williams, they come in with big ideas and no understanding of how the real world works. They fire experienced people like me and replace them with diversity hires and recent college graduates who don't know a turbine from a toaster. Bradley took another sip of his drink, his movements becoming increasingly sloppy. But here's the thing, Bradley continued, when Williams tries to run Meridian without me. He's going to fail, and when he fails, all those consulting contracts are going to disappear into the Cayman financial network, and I'm going to disappear to a beach where extradition is complicated. Harold closed his notebook with a soft snap that somehow sounded louder than the jet engines. You seem very confident that Mr. Williams will fail, Harold observed. Oh, I'm certain of it, Bradley said with the absolute conviction of someone who had never been wrong about anything important. See, Williams thinks he's buying a manufacturing company, but what he's really buying is me. My relationships, my knowledge, my operational expertise. Without me, Meridian is just expensive real estate and obsolete equipment. Bradley leaned back in his seat, his feet still propped disrespectfully on the bulkhead. And when Williams realizes that he needs me more than I need him, I'll be in a very strong negotiating position. He'll meet my salary demands, my equity requirements, my operational autonomy, because if he doesn't, I'll take my knowledge and my relationships to his competitors. Harold felt a profound sadness settle over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about Bradley's crimes, though those were serious enough to send him to federal prison for a decade. This was about the complete moral bankruptcy of someone Harold had trusted with significant responsibility. What if he's smarter than you think? Harold asked, quietly. Bradley's laugh was sharp and bitter. Smarter? Please. I've been researching Marcus Williams for weeks, ever since the acquisition was announced. No MBA, no manufacturing experience, no connections in our industry. He's a computer programmer who got lucky with a few tech patents and convinced some venture capitalists to give him money. Bradley gestured dismissively, nearly spilling his drink. The guy probably doesn't even know what we manufacture at Meridian. Turbine components, precision machinery, industrial automation structures. You think some kid from Chicago who built a software company understands any of that? Harold thought about Marcus Williams cramped into seat 14B, quietly reviewing the very financial statements that contained evidence of Bradley's crimes. Marcus, who had built quantum dynamics from nothing into a company worth enough to acquire Meridian Industries. Marcus, who had identified the operational inefficiencies and suspicious accounting variances that Harold himself had missed. "You might be underestimating him," Harold said. "Impossible," Bradley replied with absolute certainty. "See, I know his type. They come in with big words and bigger promises. But when it comes to actually running a real business with real products and real problems, they fold faster than a lawn chair in a hurricane." Bradley finished his drink and set the glass down with the satisfied thunk of someone who had just solved all the world's problems. "The beautiful thing is, Williams needs me. He can fire me if he wants, but if he does, he'll lose 40% of our client relationships and all of our institutional knowledge. Our suppliers trust me. Our customers rely on me. Our processes depend on me. Without me, the whole operation falls apart within 6 months." Harold reopened his notebook and added one final entry: threats to sabotage company operations. Admission of essential role in criminal activities. Complete lack of remorse or understanding of consequences. Then he closed the notebook again and looked at Bradley with the expression of a man watching a natural disaster unfold in real time. "Mr. Harrison." Harold said, his voice carrying a formality that made Bradley look up from his empty glass. "You've given me a great deal to think about," Harold Bradley said, trying to match the older man's serious tone, but failing due to his intoxication. "I hope you understand that everything I've told you tonight is strictly confidential. Professional courtesy, you understand." Harold nodded slowly, though his definition of professional courtesy was about to be very different from Bradley's expectations. "Of course," Harold said. "I wouldn't dream of sharing any of this with the wrong people." The emphasis on wrong people was subtle, but deliberate. Harold had no intention of sharing this conversation with the wrong people, but he had every intention of sharing it with exactly the right person. Marcus Williams, the man who was about to become Bradley Harrison's boss, judge, and jury all at once. Bradley settled back into his stolen seat with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had just made a valuable ally. He had no idea that he had actually just confessed to multiple felonies in front of a witness who had documented every word. And he certainly had no idea that the man he'd been bragging about outsmarting was sitting 200 feet behind him, reviewing financial statements that would expose every crime Bradley had just admitted to committing. The plane flew on through the night, carrying Bradley Harrison toward a reckoning that would end his career, his freedom, and his carefully constructed delusions of superiority. He just didn't know it yet. The turbulence didn't start with a gentle bump or a polite warning. It started with the universe reminding everyone aboard Flight 104 that human arrogance was no match for the raw physics of atmosphere and gravity. The first sign came at 35,000 feet somewhere over the dark expanse of the North Atlantic when the plane hit what meteorologists call clear air turbulence, invisible pockets of chaotic wind that can drop an aircraft hundreds of feet in seconds without warning. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed on with an aggressive ding-ding-ding that cut through the cabin's peaceful hum. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with professional concern. "Folks, this is Captain Morrison. We're encountering some unexpected rough air, severe clear air turbulence over the North Atlantic. I need everyone seated with seatbelts fastened immediately. Flight attendants, take your jump seats now. This is going to be rough. In seat 1, Bradley Harrison rolled his eyes with the casual, dismissive attitude of someone who'd had too much to drink and too little experience with real consequences. "Drama queens," he muttered to Harold, not bothering to fasten his seatbelt. He reached for his sixth mimosa of the flight, the glass wobbling slightly in his unsteady grip. "These pilots always oversell the bumps. Makes them feel important." Harold looked at Bradley with a mixture of disbelief and growing alarm. Even drunk, even arrogant, even criminally stupid, how could someone ignore a direct safety instruction from the flight crew, Mr. Harrison? Harold said firmly, "You should fasten your seatbelt. I'm fine." Bradley waved him off, taking another sip of champagne. "I've been flying longer than some of these pilots have been alive. A little chop never hurt anyone." That's when the floor dropped out from under them. It wasn't a shake or a bump or even a violent jolt. It was a plummet. The Boeing 777 dropped 400 feet in less than 3 seconds, as if the air beneath them had simply vanished. The sensation was like riding the world's most violent elevator if that elevator had suddenly lost its cables while traveling at 500 miles per hour. The cabin erupted in screams. Passenger service items that had been secured moments before became projectiles. In the galley, a steel coffee pot flew upward and smashed against the ceiling, spraying hot liquid across the white cabin walls like abstract art painted in espresso. And Bradley Harrison, who had been too arrogant to fasten his seatbelt, was launched upward like a rag doll. His head struck the overhead compartment with a sickening crack that could be heard over the screaming passengers and groaning aircraft. Blood immediately began streaming from his nose as he crashed back down into seat 1, his expensive Armani suit now decorated with crimson stains and shattered glass from his mimosa. "My nose!" Bradley shrieked, his voice high and nasal from the injury. Blood was pouring through his fingers as he clutched his face. "I'm bleeding! Someone help me!" "This is the airline's fault. I'm going to sue." But the plane wasn't finished with its violent lesson in physics. The aircraft shuddered and bucked like an angry bull, banking hard to the left as Captain Morrison fought to find smoother air. The overhead bins rattled ominously, and several passengers were thrown against their restraints hard enough to leave bruises. In seat 1B, something much more serious was happening to Harold Meridian. The sudden drop had slammed his chest against his armrest with tremendous force, but the physical impact had triggered something worse than bruised ribs. Harold felt a crushing pain in his left arm, radiating up toward his chest, like lightning made of molten steel. His face went ashen, then gray, then an alarming shade of blue-white that suggested his cardiovascular network was failing. His breathing became ragged and shallow. His eyes rolled back, showing too much white. His left hand clutched weakly at his chest while his right reached desperately toward the call button, his movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated. "Help," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos filling the cabin. "My heart. Pills." He was having a massive angina attack, possibly a full cardiac event, triggered by the physical shock of the turbulence and the emotional stress of listening to Bradley's criminal confessions for the past hour. At 64 years old, with a family history of heart disease and decades of CEO-level stress. Harold Meridian was dying in seat 1B, while the plane bucked and rolled through the violent air. And Bradley Harrison, bleeding and panicking about his Italian suit, didn't even notice. "Hey, old man," Bradley yelled at Harold, blood still streaming from his nose. "Stop leaning on me. I've got glass all over my lap, and this suit cost more than most people make in a month." Harold reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers barely able to grasp Bradley's sleeve. His skin was cold and clammy, his pulse weak and irregular. "Please," Harold gasped each word a monumental effort. "Pills in my bag. Nitroglycerin." Bradley looked down at Harold's hand on his expensive fabric and reacted with the kind of selfish disgust that defined his character. "Get off me!" Bradley snapped, slapping Harold's hand away like he was swatting an insect. You're wrinkling the fabric. Jesus Christ, you're probably having a panic attack or something. Stewardess, this guy is dying or something. Get him away from me. The callousness was breathtaking, even drunk, even injured, even surrounded by chaos. Bradley's first instinct was to protect his clothing and distance himself from someone else's medical emergency. It was selfishness, distilled to its purest form. Jessica Morgan, the flight attendant who had witnessed Bradley's theft of Marcus's seat, was fighting her way forward from her jump seat, using the seatbacks for stability as the plane continued to pitch and roll. She could see that first class had become a disaster zone. Blood on the walls, broken glass scattered across expensive leather seats, and 2 passengers in obvious distress. But when she reached row 1 and saw the scene, her priorities became crystal clear. Bradley was bleeding from what appeared to be a broken nose, painful but not life-threatening. Harold was unconscious, his skin gray, his breathing barely perceptible. Code red. Jessica shouted to her colleague in the rear galley, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the emergency. Medical emergency in 1B. I need the medical kit and oxygen now. The announcement went out over the cabin speakers. Is there a doctor on board? We have a medical emergency in first class. If you are a medical professional, please identify yourself to the crew immediately. Silence. No one moved. The turbulence was still severe enough that most passengers were gripping their armrests and praying not volunteering for additional responsibilities. From the back of the plane, Marcus Williams heard the announcement and felt something shift inside his chest. He wasn't a doctor. His expertise was in artificial intelligence and business strategy, but he was a certified wilderness first responder, a qualification he'd earned during his years leading climbing expeditions before he'd entered the corporate world. More importantly, he was the only person on the plane who seemed to understand that some things were more important than personal comfort. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up in the cramped economy cabin, his 6'3" frame unfolding like a Swiss Army knife being opened. The teenager next to him looked up from his phone with annoyed confusion. "Dude, we're supposed to stay seated," the kid said. Marcus didn't respond. He was already moving up the aisle using the seatbacks for stability as the plane continued to lurch through the turbulent air. Passengers stared at him as he passed, some with admiration, some with confusion. All of them wondering why someone from economy was heading toward first class during an emergency. "I have medical training," Marcus announced as he reached the curtain separating the cabins. "Let me through." Jessica looked up from where she was kneeling beside Harold's seat, her hands full of medical equipment she wasn't entirely sure how to use. "Are you a doctor?" she asked hopefully. "Wilderness first responder," Marcus replied, which wasn't exactly what she'd hoped to hear but was infinitely better than nothing. "Step aside." Marcus knelt beside Harold's seat and immediately began assessing the situation with the calm efficiency of someone who'd dealt with medical emergencies in remote locations where help was hours or days away. He checked Harold's pulse thready and weak. He checked his airway clear but compromised by his positioning. He checked his skin color gray, indicating poor circulation. Classic angina presentation. Marcus said, his voice calm and authoritative despite the chaos around them. Possibly full MI. He needs his cardiac medication immediately. He said something about pills. Jessica offered, her voice shaking. "In his bag." "Find them now." Marcus ordered, his hands already positioning Harold's head to improve his breathing. "Look for nitroglycerin, probably in a small brown bottle." As Jessica frantically searched Harold's carry-on bag, Marcus became aware of Bradley's continued complaints about his bloody nose and ruined suit. "This is negligence," Bradley was shouting at no one in particular. "The airline is going to pay for this. Do you know what this suit cost? Do you know who I am? I'm going to own Delta Airlines when my lawyers are finished with them." Marcus turned his head slowly and looked at Bradley with an expression that would have frozen the North Atlantic itself. It was a look devoid of anger. Anger would have been merciful. This was pure cold calculation, the gaze of someone evaluating whether another human being was worth the oxygen they were consuming. "Shut up," Marcus said quietly, but his voice carried the kind of authority that made grown men reconsider their life choices. Bradley's mouth snapped shut involuntarily, some primitive part of his brain recognizing that he was in the presence of a superior predator. Jessica found the nitroglycerin and handed the small bottle to Marcus with trembling fingers. Marcus carefully placed one tablet under Harold's tongue while maintaining his airway, then reached for the portable oxygen tank that Jessica had brought from the medical kit. "Sir, can you hear me?" Marcus asked Harold gently. "You're having a cardiac event, but we're going to take care of you. Just breathe slowly and let the medication work." The plane lurched again, harder this time, and Marcus braced himself with one arm wrapped around Harold to prevent the older man from being thrown from his seat. He was essentially serving as a human shock absorber, using his own body to protect a man he'd never met from the violent forces trying to tear the aircraft apart. For 10 minutes that felt like hours, it was a battle between Marcus's first aid training and the laws of physics. The plane bucked and rolled through the worst turbulence any of them had ever experienced. But Marcus never let go of Harold, never stopped monitoring his vitals, never stopped providing the steady, calm presence that kept a dying man anchored to life. Gradually, slowly, the nitroglycerin began to work. Color returned to Harold's cheeks. His breathing became deeper and more regular. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then gradually clearing as the immediate crisis passed. When Harold's vision focused, the first thing he saw was Marcus Williams, the man Bradley had humiliated, the man Harold had watched sacrifice his first-class seat for the greater good, the man who was now kneeling on the cabin floor and holding him steady while the world tried to shake itself apart. Marcus Harold whispered, his voice weak but clear. "Is that you?" "I've got you, Mr. Meridian," Marcus said softly, using Harold's name for the first time. "You're going to be fine." Harold's eyes widened slightly. "You know who I am." "I know a lot of things," Marcus replied with a small smile. "But right now, let's focus on keeping you stable. We'll have plenty to talk about when we land." The turbulence began to subside as Captain Morrison found smoother air at a different altitude. The fastened seatbelt sign remained on, but the violent pitching and rolling had decreased to manageable levels. Passengers throughout the cabin were beginning to assess the damage spilled. Drinks, scattered belongings, and, in the case of first class, one bleeding executive and one cardiac patient. By the time the worst of the emergency had passed, Harold was sitting upright and sipping water, weak but stable. The immediate danger had passed, though he would need proper medical attention once they landed at Heathrow. Harold refused to let Marcus return to his cramped economy seat. "Absolutely not," Harold said, his voice returning to its CEO timbre, despite his recent brush with death. "Jessica, is the jump seat available?" "Yes, Mr. Meridian," Jessica replied, still shaken by what she'd witnessed. "Mr. Williams sits here with us," Harold commanded, gesturing to the flight attendant jump seat that faced both first-class rows. "I need him nearby in case I have another episode." Bradley, who had finally managed to stop his nosebleed using half a dozen cloth napkins, looked up from his ruined suit with indignation. "Great," he said sarcastically, his voice still nasal from his injury. "Now we have the economy passenger permanently stationed in first class. Isn't that against FAA regulations or something?" "I don't care about FAA regulations," Harold snapped, showing his first real flash of anger toward Bradley since the flight began. "This man saved my life while you were crying about your dry cleaning bill. If you say another word about him, I'll have you moved to the cargo hold." Marcus took the jump seat, positioning himself so that he was facing both Harold and Bradley. The dynamic had shifted completely. What had started as a stolen seat dispute had become something much more complex and dangerous. The cabin had become a boardroom with Marcus at the center of it. Harold took a deep breath, looking between Marcus and Bradley with the expression of a man who had just seen behind the curtain of his own company. He had listened to Bradley confess to multiple felonies. He had watched Bradley ignore safety instructions and assault Harold when he needed help. And he had watched Marcus risk his own safety to save the life of a stranger. Harold made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't wait for London. He couldn't let this play out in some sterile conference room with lawyers and accountants. The truth needed to come out now at 30,000 feet, with witnesses present and nowhere for anyone to run. Mr. Williams, Harold said formally, "I believe we should accelerate our timeline." Marcus nodded, understanding perfectly what Harold meant, even though Bradley remained obliviously focused on dabbing blood from his expensive clothing. "I think that would be appropriate," Marcus agreed. Bradley looked up from his napkins, confusion beginning to penetrate his alcohol-induced haze. "Timeline for what?" Bradley asked. "What are you two talking about? And how do you know each other?" Harold smiled for the first time since the turbulence began. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Oh, we're about to become very well acquainted," Harold said. "All three of us." The plane flew on through the night, its passengers unaware that they were about to witness the most dramatic corporate takeover in aviation history. The cabin had achieved an eerie calm after the violent turbulence, but the atmosphere in first class was crackling with a different kind of energy entirely. Harold Meridian sat in seat 1B, still pale but alert, his near-death experience having crystallized something that had been building for years. Marcus Williams occupied the flight attendant jump seat, facing both men with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that the next few minutes would determine the trajectory of multiple lives. And Bradley Harrison, still dabbing blood from his nose with expensive cloth napkins, remained blissfully unaware that he was about to become the central figure in his own professional execution. Harold reached into his briefcase, the same leather case that had held his life-saving nitroglycerin, and pulled out a thick blue folder. The cover was embossed with silver foil that caught the cabin lighting, Confidential Quantum Dynamics and Meridian Industries, Merger and Acquisition Strategy. Bradley's eyes locked onto the folder like a heat-seeking missile finding its target. The blood drained from his face faster than it had during the turbulence, leaving him an ashen gray that had nothing to do with his recent head injury. "Wait a minute," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "What is that? How do you have merger documents? Who are you?" Harold ignored the questions and turned his attention to Marcus with the formal courtesy of one CEO addressing another. "Mr. Williams." Harold said, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades in corporate leadership. "I apologize for the unconventional nature of this introduction. I assume you were traveling to London for our transition meeting on January 2nd. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp with understanding. "I was. I am." Bradley's head swiveled between the two men like he was watching a tennis match played with words he didn't understand. "Transition meeting." Bradley's voice was rising in pitch and volume. "What transition meeting? What are you talking about? He's a passenger from economy. He doesn't even belong in first class." Harold opened the confidential folder and handed it to Marcus, the gesture formal but weighted with significance. Other passengers in first class had stopped their conversations entirely, sensing that something momentous was happening in row 1. "Mr. Williams," Harold continued, "I was reviewing the personnel files for the restructuring. I've been struggling with some decisions regarding senior management retention, particularly in the operations department." Marcus took the folder and opened it, though he didn't look at the papers inside. His gaze remained fixed on Bradley, who was beginning to resemble a man watching his own execution. "I've reviewed the numbers," Harold Marcus said, dropping the formal Mr. Meridian and shifting into peer-to-peer mode. His voice, changed, completely gone, was the polite tone of a passenger dealing with airline staff. This was the sharp, decisive voice of a majority shareholder discussing the future of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. "The Q4 variances are troubling," Marcus continued, "and frankly, the operational culture appears to be toxic." Bradley put down his bloody napkins, his hands beginning to tremble as the reality of the situation crashed over him like ice water. Wait, Bradley said, his voice becoming increasingly frantic. How do you know about Q? 4 variances. Who are you? What's going on here? Marcus closed the folder and leaned forward slightly, invading Bradley's personal space with the deliberate confidence of someone who held all the cards. You asked me earlier if I knew who you were. Marcus said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of inevitability. You're Bradley Harrison. You've embezzled $4 million into Cayman shell companies. You manipulate inventory between New Jersey and London to hide quarterly losses. You accept kickbacks from vendors, and you treat service staff like garbage. Each accusation hit Bradley like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain struggling to process how this stranger knew details about his criminal activities that he'd never shared with anyone except... Bradley's eyes went wide with horror as he turned to stare at Harold. You were listening. Bradley whispered, the full scope of his mistake finally becoming clear. You were recording everything I said. You're not just some random passenger. Harold shook his head slowly, his expression mixing pity with disgust. Bradley, Harold said you really are the most unobservant executive I have ever employed. Harold gestured toward Marcus with the theatrical flourish of a master magician revealing his greatest trick. I'd like you to meet the diversity hire kid you were telling me about. Harold continued. The one who supposedly doesn't understand manufacturing. The one who got his startup money from government grants. Harold's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the silent cabin every word carried like thunder. Bradley Harrison, meet Marcus Williams, founder and CEO of Quantum Dynamics. He currently owns 51% of Meridian Industries. As of this morning, he's your boss. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that follows explosions when the shock wave has passed, but the dust hasn't yet settled. Passengers throughout first class stared openly, now their phones discreetly recording what was clearly going to be viral content within hours. Bradley looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time. He saw the expensive hoodie that he'd dismissed as streetwear. He saw the vintage leather bag that spoke of world travel and success. And finally, he saw the Audemars Piguet watch on Marcus's wrist, partially visible now that his sleeve had shifted during the medical emergency. The watch alone was worth more than Bradley's annual salary. No, Bradley whispered the word carrying the weight of complete denial. No, that's impossible. You were in economy. You gave up your seat. You can't be... I was in one. Marcus corrected him, his voice ice cold. Until you stole it. Bradley's world was collapsing in real time. Every assumption, every prejudice, every arrogant dismissal of the past 6 hours was being revealed as not just wrong, but catastrophically career-endingly wrong. Mr. Grant Bradley stammered, using Marcus's first name like a life preserver. Marcus, sir, there's been a misunderstanding. The stress of the flight. The alcohol, you know how it is. We can work this out. I'm the best operations VP you'll ever find. I know the market. I know our suppliers. I know everything about running Meridian. You know how to steal. Marcus replied flatly. And you know how to let a man die because you're worried about your suit. Bradley's desperation was palpable now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool cabin air. I can explain the Cayman accounts, Bradley said rapidly. It's not what it sounds like. Those are legitimate consulting arrangements. Everything was properly documented, properly approved through normal channels. By yourself, Harold interjected. You approved contracts with shell companies that you controlled. That's called embezzlement, Bradley. And in federal court, it's called wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Marcus reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a pen, a simple ballpoint that somehow looked ominous in his hands. He opened the confidential folder and began writing on the top page with deliberate measured strokes. What are you doing? Bradley asked, his voice climbing toward panic. I'm saving us both some time in London, Marcus said without looking up from his writing. I'm drafting your termination letter. For cause. You can't do that. Bradley shrieked, his composure finally shattering completely. I have a contract. I have rights. I have 20 years of experience in this industry. You had rights, Harold interjected calmly, until you admitted to multiple federal crimes in front of 2 witnesses at 30,000 feet. That falls under the gross misconduct clause of your employment agreement, which means no golden parachute, no severance package, and definitely no retirement in the Cayman Islands. Bradley looked around the cabin, desperately searching for an ally. A sympathetic face, anyone who might take his side against this nightmare that his own words had created. But the other first-class passengers were looking at him with expressions ranging from disgust to fascination, the kind of morbid interest people have when watching a train wreck in slow motion. Jessica, the flight attendant he'd bullied and threatened, was standing nearby with a fresh bottle of water for Harold. When Bradley's eyes met hers, she offered him a tiny, satisfied smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sir, Jessica said with exaggerated politeness, I hope your nose feels better. Though I have to warn you that police vehicles typically have very limited legroom. You might be more comfortable than you expect. The implication was clear. Law enforcement was waiting for him at Heathrow. Marcus finished writing and looked up at Bradley with the expression of a surgeon who had just completed a particularly distasteful but necessary amputation. We have 4 hours until we land at Heathrow, Marcus said, checking his Audemars Piguet with deliberate theatricality. I suggest you use that time to delete any personal files from your company devices, Bradley, because the moment we touch British soil, corporate security will be escorting you off the premises and your access to all Meridian accounts and network will be permanently revoked. Bradley slumped back into his stolen seat 1A, the throne he'd fought so hard to claim and defend. But now it felt less like a symbol of status and more like an electric chair, and he was waiting for someone to throw the switch. This isn't over, Bradley said weakly, though his voice carried no conviction. My lawyers will fight this. I'll claim entrapment coercion under medical duress. That recording was made without my consent. What recording? Harold asked with mock innocence. I was simply having a conversation with a fellow passenger. I took notes because I have a poor memory for details. As for consent, you were speaking quite loudly in a public space. I think you'll find that expectation of privacy is difficult to establish at 30,000 feet. Harold pulled out his leather notebook and flipped through several pages of neat handwriting. Shell companies, $4 million. Inventory manipulation, 3 years. Vendor kickbacks ongoing. Money laundering, Cayman Islands. Racist statements, multiple instances. Threats to sabotage company operations documented. Harold closed the notebook with a soft snap. I think my memory is improving. Marcus stood up from the jump seat and moved to the window, looking out at the dark Atlantic Ocean far below. The lights of a ship were visible in the distance, a tiny speck of civilization in a vast emptiness that suddenly seemed like a metaphor for Bradley's future prospects. You know what the ironic thing is, Bradley Marcus said without turning around. If you had simply been professional, if you had treated people with basic human decency, if you had done your job honestly, you would have been fine. Meridian needs experienced operations people. I would have kept you on, probably even given you a raise. Marcus turned back to face Bradley, who was staring at him with the hollow expression of a man watching his entire life disappear. But you couldn't do that, Marcus continued. You had to steal a seat that didn't belong to you. You had to make assumptions about people based on their appearance. You had to confess to federal crimes while drunk on an airplane. You did this to yourself, Bradley. Every single bit of it. The truth of it hit Bradley like a physical blow. This wasn't bad luck or a setup or corporate conspiracy. This was simply the consequence of his own actions, his own words, his own character flaws finally catching up with him. Please, Bradley whispered, the fight gone out of him entirely. I have 2 ex-wives. I have alimony payments. I need this job. You should have thought about that, Marcus replied quietly, before you decided to treat a dying man's medical emergency as an inconvenience to your wardrobe. The plane flew on through the night, carrying Bradley Harrison toward a reckoning that would end with handcuffs headlines and a federal prison sentence that would give him plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had led him to this moment. But the story wasn't over yet. The best part was still to come. The descent into London Heathrow was a masterclass in anticipation and dread. As the massive Boeing 777 broke through the gray English clouds, the mechanical sounds of flaps extending and landing gear deploying created a symphony of finality that resonated differently for each passenger in first class. For most travelers, these were the sounds of arrival safety and the successful completion of a journey. For Bradley, Harrison slumped in his stolen seat, 1A. They sounded like the tumblers of a prison lock clicking into place. The wheels touched the tarmac with the violent screech of rubber against asphalt, followed immediately by the thunderous roar of reverse thrusters. The force threw everyone forward against their seatbelts, a final physical reminder that some forces in the universe were beyond anyone's control to manipulate or steal. As the aircraft taxied toward Terminal 3, Bradley stared out the window with the hollow expression of someone watching his own funeral procession. He had stopped trying to negotiate, stopped making threats, stopped insisting that this was all a misunderstanding. The weight of reality had finally penetrated his alcohol-addled brain, and he understood with crystal clarity that his career, his reputation, and his freedom were about to end in very public fashion. The plane came to a complete stop at Gate 24. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed off with its characteristic cheerful ding, and immediately the cabin filled with the familiar sounds of passengers eager to escape their metal prison seatbelt buckles clicking open. Overhead bins snapping apart, feet shuffling impatiently in the aisles. But before anyone could stand up, before the first passenger could reach for their carry-on luggage, the flight service manager's voice cut through the cabin with sharp authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have been instructed by ground authorities to hold all passenger disembarkation. Please clear the aisles immediately and return to your seats. I repeat, please remain seated." A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the plane. Passengers who had already stood up reluctantly settled back into their seats, wondering if there was a security threat, a medical emergency, or some other crisis that required them to remain trapped in the aircraft. Bradley felt his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. He sank lower into seat 1A, wishing the expensive leather would somehow swallow him whole and transport him to anywhere but here. The forward cabin door hissed open with mechanical finality. Usually this moment brought the smiling face of a gate agent welcoming passengers to their destination. Instead, cold January air swept into the cabin, followed by 4 imposing figures who carried the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. 2 were uniformed officers from the Metropolitan Police, their high-visibility vests stark against the muted luxury of the first-class cabin. They flanked 2 men in sharp, dark suits, agents from the Serious Fraud Office, Britain's elite financial crimes unit. None of them looked at the confused passengers in rows 2 and 3. Their eyes were locked on a specific target. The lead officer, a tall man with military bearing and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, marched directly to seat 1A with the purposeful stride of someone executing a warrant. Bradley Harrison, the officer, barked. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation backed by the full weight of international law enforcement cooperation. Bradley looked up from his blood-stained napkins, his face ashen with terror and resignation. "Yes," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the idling aircraft. "That's me." "Stand up, Mr. Harrison," the officer commanded, his tone brooking no argument. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Bradley's legs were unsteady as he rose from the stolen seat that had cost him everything. He tried to summon the corporate bravado that had carried him through 15 years of bullying suppliers and intimidating subordinates, but his voice came out as a pathetic whimper. Is there some kind of problem, officer? I'm a very busy man, and I have important meetings in London. Perhaps we could sort this out at a more convenient time. One of the suited SFO agents stepped forward, his credentials held high like a sword of justice. "I am Agent Miller with the Serious Fraud Office," he announced in a voice that carried throughout the silent cabin. "You are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud by abuse of position, money laundering, and grand larceny." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Every passenger within earshot was straining to hear smartphones emerging from pockets and purses to capture what was clearly going to be viral content within the hour. Fraud. Bradley squeaked, his voice cracking with panic. That's ridiculous. These are civil matters at most, accounting irregularities, maybe some paperwork issues. You can't arrest someone for business decisions. It's not a civil matter when you funnel $4 million into Cayman shell companies, Agent Miller replied dryly. And it's certainly not a paperwork issue when you attempt to destroy evidence on corporate devices mid-flight. The cold, metallic click-click of handcuffs engaging echoed through the silent cabin like the sound of justice finally arriving at its destination. It was a sound of finality of consequences of a man's carefully constructed delusions meeting the immutable reality of the law. "I didn't do it," Bradley shouted, his composure finally shattering completely as the handcuffs tightened around his wrists. "This is a setup, a conspiracy. I'm being framed." His wild eyes landed on Marcus Williams, who was standing calmly beside his seat, his leather bag slung over his shoulder with the patient dignity of someone who had won without having to raise his voice. "Him," Bradley screamed, jerking his head toward Marcus like a man possessed. "He's the one. He hacked my phone. He's working for competitors. He's trying to destroy me. Arrest him." Agent Miller looked at Marcus, then back at Bradley with an expression of pitying disgust. "Mr. Williams isn't working for your competitors," Mr. Harrison Miller said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Mr. Williams is the majority owner of the company you've been stealing from. He's the one who authorized this investigation." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. The whispers started immediately spreading through the cabin like wildfire. "That's the owner. The guy in the hoodie. Oh, this is perfect." The walk of shame began. Bradley was marched down the aisle past every witness to his downfall, each step a monument to his own arrogance and stupidity. He passed Harold Meridian in seat 1B, the man whose life he'd ignored while complaining about his expensive suit. Harold looked at him with the kind of disappointed sadness usually reserved for wayward children. Harold Bradley pleaded, his voice breaking with desperation. "Tell them I'm a good employee. Tell them I've made money for the company. Tell them this is all a misunderstanding." Harold slowly removed his wire-rimmed glasses and polished them with deliberate care. "You were a liability, Bradley," Harold said quietly, "in business and in life. Goodbye." Bradley was marched past Jessica, the flight attendant he had threatened and berated throughout the flight. She was standing by the galley door holding a plastic trash bag filled with the empty champagne bottles that had fueled his confessions. As the handcuffed executive was pushed past her, Jessica offered him the same bright professional smile she'd given him when he'd first boarded the aircraft. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with sweet vindication. "Please watch your head on the way out, and do have a lovely stay in London, though I hear the accommodations might be a bit more institutional than you're accustomed to." Bradley opened his mouth to curse her, but the officer shoved him forward onto the jet bridge before he could speak. The cold air of the terminal hit him like a slap, but it brought no relief from the nightmare his life had become. As the cabin door closed behind the arrest party, the tension in first class broke like a dam bursting. Passengers erupted in excited chatter phones, buzzing with messages and social media posts, everyone eager to share their first-hand account of corporate justice served at 30,000 feet. Marcus Williams stepped forward, extending his hand to Harold Meridian, with the courtesy of one leader greeting another. "Are you ready?" Harold Marcus asked. "Do you need wheelchair assistance?" Harold stood up slowly, testing his balance after his cardiac episode. The nitroglycerin had done its job, and the satisfaction of watching justice served seemed to have revitalized him completely. "No, Marcus," Harold said with a smile. "I think I can walk. In fact, I feel lighter than I have in years." They walked off the plane together, not as boss and employee, not as buyer and seller, but as partners united by their shared commitment to integrity and excellence. The transition of power that was supposed to happen in a London conference room had instead taken place in the sky, witnessed by strangers who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. As they reached the jet bridge, Agent Miller was waiting with a tablet full of digital paperwork. "Mr. Williams." "Mr. Meridian." He nodded respectfully. "Thank you for the real-time data transmission during the flight. It allowed us to expedite the warrant process considerably. We'll need formal statements from both of you, but that can wait until after you've had some rest." "We'll come now," Marcus said firmly. "I want this matter closed before the London markets open on January 2nd. Agent Miller nodded approvingly. "Understood. Professional efficiency. I appreciate that in civilians." As they walked through the terminal past the early morning crowds of travelers reuniting with loved ones, Marcus felt his phone buzzing with notifications. It had finally reconnected to the UK cellular network, and messages were flooding in from around the world. One message stood out from the others. It was from his mother in Chicago, sent hours earlier when she'd woken up to start her New Year's Day. "Happy New Year, baby. Did you make it to London? Okay? I know you hate flying, but I hope you got a good seat. Love you." Marcus stopped walking and read the message twice. He thought about the seat he'd paid for the seat he'd given up, and the extraordinary chain of events that had unfolded because of one man's arrogance and another man's integrity. He typed back, "Happy New Year, Ma. Yeah, I made it safe. And don't worry about the seat, I ended up exactly where I needed to be." The view was perfect. The consequences for Bradley Harrison were swift, public, and absolute. Within hours of his arrest, footage of his handcuffed perp walk was trending across every social media platform. News outlets picked up the story of the executive who'd stolen a seat from his own future boss, and the narrative spread globally with the viral intensity that only stories of perfect justice can achieve. The criminal trial took place 4 months later at Southwark Crown Court. Bradley's defense team attempted to argue that his airplane confessions were the result of medical trauma and alcohol impairment, but Harold Meridian's testimony was devastating. Harold recounted in precise detail not only Bradley's criminal admissions, but also his callous disregard for a dying man, painting a picture of moral bankruptcy that the jury found impossible to ignore. Bradley was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to defraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and violation of his fiduciary duties as a corporate officer. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison with all of his assets frozen to repay the stolen funds. His retirement fund in the Cayman Islands was repatriated to Meridian's accounts, where it would fund employee bonuses rather than beachfront vacations. But the real story wasn't Bradley's destruction, it was Marcus's construction of something better. 2 days after Flight 104 landed at Heathrow, Marcus Williams stood on the stage of Meridian Industries' main manufacturing facility in London, looking out at an audience of employees who had expected the worst and were about to receive something unprecedented in corporate history. The workers had gathered in the main assembly hall, a cavernous space where turbine components were manufactured with precision that could be measured in microns. They'd heard rumors about the American buyout, whispers about layoffs and downsizing fears that their jobs would be shipped overseas or eliminated entirely by artificial intelligence. Instead, Marcus walked onto the stage wearing a tailored suit. This time, though he kept the Audemars Piguet watch that had become something of a legend among the employees who'd heard about the airplane incident. Harold Meridian stood beside him not as a defeated former CEO, but as chairman emeritus of a company entering its next chapter. 3 days ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone device. Your former VP of operations confessed to stealing $4 million from this company. Money that should have gone to equipment upgrades, research and development, and employee compensation. A murmur went through the crowd. Some had heard about Bradley's arrest, but the full scope of his crimes was still being revealed. Today, I'm here to tell you that every penny of that stolen money has been recovered, Marcus continued, and rather than absorbing it into corporate profits or executive bonuses, we're going to do something different. Marcus gestured to Harold, who stepped forward with a check that seemed almost comically oversized for the theatrical moment. This $4 million will be distributed immediately as a one-time bonus to every factory floor worker, maintenance technician, and line supervisor who kept this company running while Bradley Harrison was lining his own pockets, Marcus announced. Because the people who actually build things shouldn't suffer for the crimes of the people who just manage them. The response was immediate and thunderous. 200 voices erupted in cheers, applause, and not a few tears from workers who'd been struggling to make ends meet while their boss was stealing millions. It was the kind of moment that reminded everyone why justice mattered, why character counted, and why some victories were worth more than money. But Marcus wasn't finished. There's one more piece of business, he said as the applause died down. I want to tell you about someone who represents the values we're going to build this company around. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed a photo on the large screens around the assembly hall. It was Jessica Morgan, the flight attendant who had handled the crisis with professionalism and integrity despite being threatened and bullied. This woman stood up to someone who was trying to abuse his power, Marcus explained. She did the right thing even when it would have been easier to look the other way. That's the kind of character we need in leadership. Marcus looked directly into the camera that was broadcasting this announcement to Meridian facilities around the world. Jessica, if you're watching this, I want to offer you a job. Director of Corporate Culture and Employee Relations, reporting directly to me at double your current salary. Because someone who can handle a crisis at 30,000 feet can definitely handle whatever challenges we face on the ground. The story of Flight 1. 04 became more than just viral content. It became a case study in business schools, a parable about character under pressure, and a reminder that justice sometimes arrives in the most unexpected forms. Jessica accepted Marcus's offer and became one of the most effective corporate culture officers in manufacturing, implementing programs that ensured no employee would ever feel powerless in the face of abuse or discrimination. Harold Meridian transitioned into his emeritus role with the satisfaction of knowing that his life's work was in capable hands. He spent his remaining years mentoring young entrepreneurs, always telling them the same thing. Character is what you do when you think nobody is watching. But somebody is always watching. Bradley Harrison served his full sentence in federal prison, where he had plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had led him from a corporate office to a prison cell. He was released after 4 years for good behavior, but his reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that he never worked in corporate America again. He ended up managing a small logistics company in Ohio, where his past was unknown and his future was humble. But the most powerful legacy of Flight 104 wasn't about justice or consequences. It was about the quiet dignity of doing the right thing when nobody expects it. Marcus Williams continued to fly commercial, often in economy class, always treating every employee he encountered with the respect that their humanity deserved. He became known not as the CEO who destroyed an executive's career, but as the leader who proved that true power doesn't need to announce itself. 6 months after that New Year's Eve flight, Marcus received an email that made him smile. It was from his mother in Chicago, who had seen the news coverage of Bradley's trial and finally understood what had really happened on her son's flight to London. "Baby," she wrote, "I saw the news about that man who stole your seat. I'm proud of you for not letting anger make you forget who you are. Sometimes the best revenge is just being yourself and letting other people destroy themselves." Marcus printed the email and framed it in his office right next to a photo from that New Year's Eve flight. It wasn't a picture of Bradley being arrested or Harold being saved. It was a simple photo that Roberto Silva had taken and sent him later. Marcus sitting in the economy seat laptop, balanced on the tiny tray table, working quietly, while the man who had humiliated him drank champagne in stolen luxury. The caption Roberto had added was perfect, true first class. Years later, when people asked Marcus about the secret to his success, he would always give the same answer: "Karma doesn't need a boarding pass to find you. It knows exactly where you sit." If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, if you've ever been judged by your appearance rather than your character, if you've ever wondered whether doing the right thing actually matters, let this story remind you of something important. Dignity travels light, but it lands heavy. Justice may be delayed, but it's never denied. And sometimes the best seat in the house is the one where you choose to keep your integrity intact. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that justice always finds its way. Have you ever seen someone try to pull a "do you know who I am" moment and fail spectacularly? Drop your story in the comments below. We love hearing from you, and your experiences help inspire future videos. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these powerful stories of justice, karma, and the triumph of character over privilege. Because sometimes the most important lessons come from 30,000 feet in the air, where the only thing that matters is who you really are when the masks come off. Thank you for flying with us today. Until next time, remember that the next time someone asks if you know who they are, you might want to make sure you know who you're talking to first. Safe travels, everyone.